But I want to welcome everybody to our demonstration here. What this is all about is there are tools out there that we're uncovering, we're discovering that states might be interested or might be able to use. And in this case, this one, Bill Wren-Smith of Windsor Solutions has spearheaded the development of a plug-in for ICIS full batch. And what that means is that states typically have a node. Every state actually out there has a node of some sort, and a node acts as a switching station on the exchange network to transfer data electronically between states or between EPA, with EPA and back out from EPA to the states. So most people tend to have one of two nodes, including Windsor. It's called the OpenNode. And they develop plugins to go along with them for a lot of the EPA, major EPA systems, and they also develop them for other state systems or activities. In this case, Bill has worked on the ICIS full batch plugin, and he's been working, we've been collaborating with him on it so that it can be a success. It is done underneath a grant for the Exchange Network, so that means that it is basically free to anybody who does have one of his nodes, the OpenNode. Especially this is the .NET version. I want to make that clear. This is the .NET version. There are two flavors. It's usually a Java and a .NET of these plugins, but this particular work for ICIS full batch is .NET only. So what I'd like to do is I would like to go ahead and turn it over to Bill to show you what he's got. Feel free to ask as many questions as you wish. I'm hoping that one or more of you, I'm sure there will be, will find this very interesting and perhaps something that you may want to use, a tool you may want to use in the future. So Bill, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you now.
Okay, thanks, Allison. This is actually the second presentation of second webinar for this presentation. However, you folks on the phone are a little bit luckier because we have, since the first presentation, released the plugin, and I've been able to enhance the presentation and add a lot more detail. And I can even show you the plugin a little bit in action. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully you can see the slides on the screen. Just a quick look at what the agenda is for today. A little bit about the project background, a little bit about OpenNode2 and some of the terminology about flows and plugins, a little bit about this project and the project timeline, and then we'll go ahead and jump right into talking about the full batch plugin and how it works and how you can potentially use it or parts of it to help your agency submit data to ICIS-NPDES. Okay, a little bit about OpenNode2 to start. OpenNode2 is open source Exchange Network node software. It's owned and maintained by ICIS. However, it is fully open source. So the source code is available for download and modification by any agency, along with the source code for any data exchanges. OpenNode2 can send data to other network partners, and that's, of course, what we're doing here with ICIS-NPDES, sending data to EPA. And also, the node can make data available for any external party who's authorized to come and query. It's pretty much the job of any node. OpenNode2 is the most widely used node software on the network, with over 30 installations across the country and beyond. And it's available for download. You can get the source code, or you can actually download the installation files or all the documentation from the URL here. It's the Google Code website for OpenNode2. A little bit about how flows work. Each type of data on the network is a flow. There's a flow for each regulatory area, such as air, waste, etc., and ICIS-NPDES is also one of them. EPA has defined the rules for sending data to the ICIS-NPDES flow. So that documentation that they published, we used as the template for how we construct the data that gets submitted over to ICIS, and also how we send it and how we process feedback from ICIS and that sort of thing. Each flow is implemented as a plugin in OpenNode2. Plugin is a probably fairly accurate term. You can actually upload a zip file into the node via its web interface, and then that plugin is installed just like that. So plugins are the software that contain the functionality needed to support a given flow. And you can get to the there are plugins for all the major regulatory flows available on the Google Code website. Actually, I might take this moment here to switch over. Here's my browser. So here is the OpenNode2 website at Google Code, and here's the download list. And here you can see we have plugins for all the major data flows, starting with ICIS, Beaches, EIS, etc. So here's all the software and documentation for OpenNode2 available for download. Okay, back to the presentation about this project in particular. Well, there's 15 ICIS-NPDES full batch states. Of course, this call is oriented towards partial batch states, but definitely, if you're interested, this software can be leveraged for states who are only sending some of their data via XML and handling the rest via data entry, regular direct data entry into ICIS. A little word about the ICIS-NPDES full batch data flow. It's pretty complex. There's 46 different data families that are supported. Each data family is a different type of data, such as permit data or inspection data, enforcement action data, etc. When you break this down, you'll notice that like over a dozen are different types of program reports, like CAFO annual reports, that sort of thing. So the core modules, there's actually far fewer than 46. In order to make available this, it broke down into 149 different tables, and among those tables, about 1,200 individual data elements or fields of data. There's over 960 business rules, too, that are enforced by ICIS. So it's a pretty complex flow, but I think we did our best to simplify it as much as possible to lower the barrier to entry to make it easier for an agency to participate in the full batch data exchange. Okay, so to reduce the implementation challenge that agencies have in submitting data to ICIS-NPDES, EPA and ECOS wanted to make available some tools to simplify the flow implementation for different agencies. And so that's where this project comes into existence. In September, EPA and ECOS engaged Windsor to develop a full batch data flow plugin for OpenNode2. It was decided that OpenNode2, since it has such a wide install base, would make a good choice and could reach a wide potential audience for pretty much getting the most bang for the buck. To reduce the cost, though, we only developed the plugin for the .NET version of OpenNode2. We do have a Java version of OpenNode2. It has all the same functions, just uses a different technology. However, it has a much smaller install base. So again, thinking of getting the most bang for the buck, we stuck with the .NET implementation at this time. Also part of this project is a pilot with the Department of Ecology in Washington. We are going to be doing this now. And now that the draft plugin is out and available for folks to start using, we're going to be proving out this beta plugin that we published by implementing a production data flow for Washington Department of Ecology. And that's starting now, and we will have implemented that full flow by mid-August of this year. And the scope of this particular project is really limited. While we certainly can answer questions that any agency might have about how to use the plugin or how this works or how they might be able to, how you might be able to accomplish a particular goal. We can support you with that. But as far as the actual implementation for Washington as part of this project. Okay, let's take a brief look at the project timeline. We completed the plugin design in January and released the staging tables to Google Code back on February 8th. Those were downloaded many times. It looks like we did announce it at that time for folks on the previous phone call, the previous webinar rather, where we introduced the plugin. Many states have begun mapping to the plugin, the staging tables that we released at that time. Just a couple days ago, we released the beta plugin to Google Code. We're going to show you that today. We're going to talk about what's in it and how it works. Looking forward down the road later this year, as I mentioned, we're going to be implementing in the state of Washington, and we'll be actually updating the plugin as we go. We'll be releasing a new version of ICIS plugin later this year. I think a November-December timeframe, and that will include compliance and enforcement modules. We will be updating the plugin to support that fully at that time. So yes, there will be releases throughout the summer. So please stay tuned to the, if you're interested and you're using this software, please stay engaged in the communication. We've got, I'll get back to this a little bit later, a couple ways that you can stay in touch. The number one way is just to keep looking at the OpenNode2 Google Code website, because we do post announcements on the front page. Also, if you revisit the download list, you can see the date the plugin or documentation was last updated. So if it's received a refresh, then you'll know there's some new information there, or new components to be downloaded and tried. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to jump into actually how the plugin works. It's a pretty traditional data flow from a very high level. It has three major phases or stages to the workflow. The first stage is the data preparation stage. The second is the submission stage. And the third is the result processing stage. A pretty typical arrangement. The data preparation stage is where the agency prepares their data from their source NPDES database and puts it into the ICIS-NPDES staging tables. Those tables are located in the agency's environment. Okay, so you're just copying data from one database to another, getting it ready to go to ICIS. The submission stage is just what it says. That's where the node comes into play, takes the data out of the tables, turns it to XML, sends it to EPA. At that point, of course, ICIS-NPDES will process the submission, and OpenNode2 at that point will retrieve a processing report and can use that information to alert individuals as to succeeded and failed transactions. And also it does some other stuff which we'll get into. So the rest of this presentation will really focus on digging in or drilling down into each of these different phases, how they work, and then therefore, of course, the capabilities of the plugin around these major phases. Okay, so delving into the workflow lifecycle. The workflow, again, is composed of these three stages. Data preparation stage, which is further broken down into two sub-stages. The first stage is the agency-specific extract, transform, and load routine, or ETL for short, which is basically just copying and transforming your data into the area where it's ready to go, getting sent to ICIS. The plugin also contains something called a change detection process. We're going to talk about this more in the coming slides, but essentially the plugin can figure out what needs to get sent to ICIS-NPDES. This takes a lot of the heavy lifting off of the agency in trying to figure out what transactions are new or change or what things need to get deleted from ICIS. The plugin can do this for you, and we'll talk about how that happens in just a moment. The submission stage, of course, and then the way the result processing stage works is the plugin will poll or repeatedly inquire EPA to say, are you done processing my submission? And when EPA says yes, then the node will then pull down the accepted and rejected reports. And it can be configured to email those reports to one or more individuals in the agency. And it can then also look in those reports and figure out what was accepted and store that information. And because it can store the information about what was accepted, then we know what's in ICIS already, because we got that information back from ICIS that the transactions were accepted. And since we know what was successfully transmitted to ICIS, we can figure out what new or changed items need to go in subsequent submissions. So that's the real secret sauce that makes the plugin capable of figuring out what needs to be sent to ICIS on its own. An important aspect of the workflow lifecycle: one full lifecycle must be complete before a new one can be started. Okay, so if you prepare data to be submitted and it gets submitted to EPA, it must at that point it's in a pending state, and it must be set to either a completed or failed state before we can kick off another workflow. So that is part of the built-in workflow management, and there's checks in place to prevent out-of-sequence execution to make sure that all of these events happen in sequence and are controlled. Okay, so a little bit more about the workflow lifecycle. This is kind of a techie slide, so bear with me, just one. There is one table in the staging database that is used to track the workflow over the lifecycle of a given workflow execution. It's called the submission tracking table, or SUBM track. There is, as a workflow is executed, one row in this table equals one workflow execution. As the workflow is executed and the submission goes through all the steps, it'll populate values in the table. When data is prepared, the ETL completion date and time is set, and the change detection completion date and time is set. Then, when the plugin submits the data to ICIS, it sets the submission date and time. It sets the transaction ID that's returned from EPA. That's our special tracking number that we use to track the submission. We also store the tracking status in the next field, the submission transaction status. The status would be pending, completed, or failed. Of course, when you first submit it, the immediate status is pending, or received or pending, actually. And then the status date and time. So as the status is repeatedly kind of checked by the plugin to see, are you done, we update the status date and time. And then after it is completed processing, the submission is completed processing at EPA, the response is then parsed. So we store a date stamp of when we pulled down the response file from EPA and parse that into the database. And throughout this whole process, we have a workflow status and a workflow status message. This is always available to you. It's a good way to audit what's going on or what went wrong with a given workflow. So again, the status here is either pending for something that's in the works, completed, or failed. Must be completed or failed before we start a new workflow. Okay, so let's talk a little bit next about the ICIS-NPDES staging tables. There are two sets of staging tables that will be set up in your agency's database. And they're identical. There's a local set of staging tables, and there's an ICIS set of staging tables. Again, these two sets of tables are identical. The local tables are where the agency will put its NPDES data that it wants to send to ICIS. And over there on the right side, the ICIS staging table set, that's a copy of all the data that was successfully sent to ICIS. So as you implement this data flow, you'd be filling up all the local tables on the left. And then you wouldn't need to you wouldn't need to write any data to the tables on the right. The plugin will manage all of the ICIS data in the ICIS tables on the right as submissions are successfully processed into ICIS. So let's just dig into how this works. Let's dig into the actual steps of the three stages in the life cycle. The first step is the data preparation stage, and that's what we call the ETL step. This is where the agency refreshes the local tables with the latest data from the agency's NPDES database. Okay, there are actually three ways to do this. This is to allow flexibility in how the agency wants to use the staging tables and wants to use the plugin. So a lot of capabilities here, flexibility in how it's set up. It should give you a lot of options for how to use the plugin should you choose to use it. The first of three ways you can load your data is a full data synchronization. Essentially transfer all the agency's NPDES data into the local staging database. The important thing here is just to keep it up to date with a regular refresh. Okay? Of course, you wouldn't want to put in state-issued permits or potentially internal outfalls, stuff that isn't tracked in ICIS. This is translated data that you do want to transmit to ICIS. Okay, there's a couple ways you could actually keep the staging data refreshed. The first way is just to purge and rebuild the data every time, or you could just do an incremental refresh, basically just adding and removing data as it's changed in the source system. You want to make those same changes reflected in the staging database. And when you use this approach, you'll let the plugin figure out what is new, changed, or deleted, and therefore figure out what needs to be sent. So the goal, or the job of the agency, is just fill up the staging tables, let the plugin do the rest. There's two other ways to use it. The first one, the next one is an incremental data refresh with automatic change detection, and the third one is just a little bit different. It's also an incremental data refresh with manual change detection. Let's discriminate between the two real quick here. Number two, in an incremental exchange, the agency only populates the data it wants to send to ICIS. Okay, so instead of refreshing the whole database with the history of the permit data for ICIS, it's just the information you want to send. This might be a useful thing to do, for example, in the DMR module. Maybe you only want to load up the data from last month, and you're going to send that all in a single push. Okay, so in order to implement this, it's less work because you're moving less data around. You're only copying chunks of data into the staging database for transmittal to ICIS. But it is a little bit more complicated to build because it requires that the agency can track what data is new or changed since the last successful submission to ICIS. We have a flag called auto-generate deletes, and you got to turn that off so that it doesn't try to delete anything you didn't put in the staging database. I can get into that a little bit more if you have specific questions about how auto-generation of deletes works, but that is an option that you can use. Again, this will let the plugin figure out what to send. The plugin knows everything that was successfully sent to ICIS in the past. It knows what you've made available to send today, and by comparing those two data sets, it can figure out what needs to be sent. Okay, so the third option is really a permutation of number two. But this is to allow the agency, if you want to set the transaction codes that tell ICIS what data is new or changed, the agency can do that in their own ETL process, and you can turn off the plugin's ability to do that. Okay, so you're not using that function that's built into the plugin that does this job. So this is just an option for those states that already have a means of figuring out what needs to be set as new or change or replace. It's a simpler architecture, but it's also more complicated to implement. Okay, so after you've loaded up the staging tables with the data you're ready to go, send, or that's ready to go to ICIS, we can kick off the change detection step. Now this is actually implemented as a stored procedure. We have flavors for Oracle and SQL Server. What this does is compares the data in ICIS local and the data in the ICIS staging environment. It figures out what's changed. And as it does it, it might say, okay, this basic permit is new. Oops, this biosolids component is gone, so I need to delete that. And everything else is the same or hasn't changed. So now it knows it's going to need to add that basic permit record to ICIS, and it's going to need to delete that biosolids permit record from ICIS. Okay, so that's signified with the plus and minus icons there next to those. Okay, and so the way the plugin actually flags this is it sets the transaction codes in the staging tables. The transaction codes, again, are new, change, or replace, NCR, or for deletes, it's D or X. And this is all described in the ICIS documentation. Okay, so now that the data is flagged and ready to go, the plugin can kick in and pull out the records that are new or changed or deleted and pop them into an XML file, and then they are, at that point, sent off to ICIS-NPDES. Okay, so there's some settings in the plugin that let you configure how the submission occurs. You have fields where you can enter in the values that get popped into the organization, contact info, and author XML elements. That gets inserted into the XML document. It's just information about the submission. Where did it come from? Who created it? That sort of thing. Also, you can set the ICIS user ID. This is the 3-character ICIS user ID that has to be inserted in the submission file. Lets ICIS know who's performing the submission. There's also a couple settings there for notification email addresses. So you can add a list of 0 or more email addresses that should receive notification from CDX as processing occurs. What this does is it inserts these email addresses into the XML header, and then when the file gets to EPA, EPA will use that information to send receipt acknowledgement and processing acknowledgements to those email addresses. There is also a flag for validating the XML before it's submitted. So you just set that to true or false, and that will occur or not occur. I would definitely recommend setting it to validate before it submits. Okay, so after it's been submitted, it gets processed at EPA, and presuming that the transaction completes successfully, returns the status as completed, the plugin will then go perform the final result processing stage, downloads the files, parses it, and stores the results. So the way it does it, pulls down the accepted and rejected transaction reports and stores that information into a result tracking table. The way these are handled is accepted records are then copied from the local environment to the ICIS environment in the staging database in the agency. So again, the table set on the right stores exactly what's in ICIS, all the stuff that's already been successfully transmitted to ICIS. And again, that is the thing that makes the change detection feature work. Okay, this is all actually encapsulated in a stored procedure, and it's executed by the plugin. There is also a set of notification email addresses that you can set in the download and processing results service. It's a separate set of notification email addresses. You can set them to be the same as were set in the submission service. What this does is this actually triggers emails from the node itself when a successful completion of the workflow occurs. So if the node is capable of downloading the processing report and parsing those results into the accepted transactions area of the staging database, then it will send a notification email to those users to say, just so you know, the submission was processed successfully, and attached are all the documents we got back from EPA. So in that email, you'll actually have the PDF transaction report that came back down from EPA. So a business staff person could then look at that and say, oh, okay, I see that this new permit got accepted, or this reissuance occurred, or all that DMR data went. Okay, so how do I audit successes and failures? All of the feedback from ICIS is stored in a result tracking table called SUBM results. The way this works is it only stores the accepted transactions from the most recent submission, and it stores all of the errors for all historical submissions for each unique business key. So for example, here's a screenshot of the the results table for a series of errors that were received back from ICIS. So these are all errors returned from ICIS. These result codes on the left-hand side, those are all enumerated in the ICIS technical documentation. And you can see it has a result type of error. There are 3 result types. One is error, of course, which means it was a failure, and the reason is there. There's also, the other 2 are accepted and warning. Both accepted and warning are used when the data is accepted into ICIS. So that will appear in the result type field as you look at this data. Okay. Okay, so that's it for looking at the workflow. Tell you what, before I jump into the downloads, what I can do is flip over to my web browser, and I can show you a little bit about I can actually show you how the schedules work. I can bring that up onto the screen. Okay, so here I am logged into OpenNode2. I'm at the dashboard, and if I go to the Exchanges tab, I can scroll down to the ICIS-NPDES exchange. Here it is, right here in the middle. I can zoom in so you can see that better. Sorry. Okay, we actually have 2 services that define the exchange. One is performing the submission, and one is getting the status and processing the results. Okay, so this one fires first, and then that one fires second. Okay, so I'm going to jump into the details of both of these so you can see how you configure the details. So for performing the submission, here's all the settings we have for how it works. Okay, you can give it a name, and then down here in the arguments area is where you set your information. So you can say the author is me, and you can enter your contact info here. And if you want, you can actually execute the stored procedure right here by putting the procedure name in the setting here. I know it's kind of a techie thing, but this actually triggers the submission, the extraction to occur in conjunction with the execution of this particular service. So you can bundle this all as one big event. Alternatively, you can clear out the procedure name field and then have some sort of external process that actually populates the staging tables if you don't want the plugin to do it. That way, if you need some separate control for the execution of that, you can do it. Otherwise, we can just leave it in here. Here's the user ID that you're submitting as. Here's a list of email addresses. And then you can semicolon separate those. Again, these get inserted into the XML, and they'll go up to EPA and tell EPA to send you the email or send emails to these as the submission is processed. Organization name here. This stuff isn't used by EPA. It just gets stuffed in the header. Who you're submitting to. This is the name of the partner that you've configured in your node. If you want it to validate the XML, yes or no. And then you can also set up data sources in the node. It's just a connection string to a given Oracle or SQL Server database, and you set that here, and tells it where to go to get the data and do its work. All right, so I'm going to go back to the Exchanges tab. I'll show you the same settings for the result processing step. Okay, much fewer arguments here that you can set. Again, a list of notification emails for folks who want to be received when submissions are successfully parsed, and then another procedure name that actually does the moving of transactions from the local area to the ICIS area in your staging environment. And that's it. I'll tell you what we can do is, the way that these services get run is through schedules. And a schedule is essentially a job that you've scheduled to run on the node. And so if we go to the Schedules tab here, we'll scroll down and we have a schedule set up, one for each of these two services. So we have two schedules. Here we go, the Perform ICIS Submission schedule and the Get Status and Download schedule. These I ran both successfully just before we started the meeting. How's that for timing? 4 minutes before we started the meeting. This was a successful submission and download, and I'll just show you exactly what the activity log shows as it actually does its work. So it starts the schedule, kicked it off. This will actually execute the schedule, and just some auditing here about the data source it's connecting to, successfully executed the ETL procedure. And then what you have here is a list of all the counts of records that it's gotten ready to submit. So for each submission type that's supported by ICIS, it's created 6 records. Okay, our test data script has 6 records for every module. Okay, and then it serializes it to XML. Then it pulls down the schema and makes sure that the schema is valid. Then it takes the XML document and validates it against the schema. In this case, it is valid. Then it submits it to the partner you've configured. This is just some auditing data about attempting the submission, and it was successfully submitted to ICIS. Here's a transaction ID returned from EPA for us to track the submission, and then it's done. Okay, and it's at the status of this particular workflow or this particular execution to completed. Okay, so this is a successful run. Okay, so a few minutes later, 2 minutes later, I ran the Get Status and Download schedule. Here it's checking the status, and CDX returned a status of completed. It was done processing the submission. Okay, so it's attempting to download the response documents. Now it's trying to process them. It's extracting it, transforming it, and saving the response to the database. It's inserted 305 records into the results tracking table. And now it's calling the stored procedure that actually moves the accepted transactions from the local area to the ICIS area in the staging environment, and then it's done. In this case, I didn't have any emails configured. If I did, you would see additional logging in here saying it successfully emailed the processing reports to those email addresses. Okay, so that's a quick look at a successful execution and what it looks like here inside the node. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and jump back to the presentation. What can I download? How does it work? Again, going back to Google Code, going to the download list. If you scroll down the list, you'll find two artifacts here that relate to this project. By the way, we do have an older plugin for Java. It just does the DMR data flow. For the 2.0 schema, it's still supported, as I recall, from at EPA, but it only does the DMR module. What you want to focus on is skip past these Java items and look at the .NET full batch items. There's the plugin download, and then there's the documentation download. Okay, two different downloads available. The plugin download, if you unzip it, contains the plugin itself, which is zipped. That's what you upload to OpenNode2. And also a bunch of database scripts. Okay, so this creates all the tables and procedures and all the other database stuff that does all the heavy lifting in the data side. If you download the documentation package, you'll find the implementation guide. It's just the facts. It describes how to install and configure the plugin and the database components. So you'll want to look at that if you want to see how do I actually set this thing up. Also bundled in the documentation is the final design specification. It's got all the nitty-gritty details of how the plugin works. I would definitely recommend, if you want to get under the hood and see how this thing works, there's a lot of detail in there that will really clarify what's happening and why as the plugin does its work. Okay, so I'm nearly done here. This is, I think, my last slide. So as a state agency, how do I actually go about implementing this? What do I have to do? Well, what you do is set up the staging tables and all the other database objects in your agency's environment. Next thing would be to map your source database to the staging tables. You'll need to map to the ICIS lookup values. We don't do lookup value translation. It's something that your ETL procedure will need to do. So if you don't use ICIS parameter codes or other valid items like sample type codes and that sort of thing, you'll need to translate those in your ETL. Then after you've got your mapping done, you need to develop the data ETL, the extraction transformation routines, to copy data from the agency database to the staging tables. Then you can set up the node and plugin. You'll need to flow data successfully to CDX test, check it out, monitor for errors, and refine your transformation logic, and then you're ready to migrate to production. Okay, so that's it for what I've prepared here. What I'd like to do is open the floor, and please use the questions window that's available over on the right-hand side if you have a question, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute your phone and you can ask a question over the phone. I'll go ahead and wait a minute or two while, in case folks want to add any questions there. Trying to think if there's anything else I can add in the meantime. Okay, yeah, there is a question here. Pop it out. I got a couple questions. Okay, didn't see these. Okay. Okay, actually, David, I'm going to go ahead and David Ramsey, Arkansas, right? You're on the air.
I am?
Now you are.
Oh, okay. Well, no, I didn't have a question. Did I raise my hand?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that. I must have clicked it by mistake. Sorry about that.
Okay. Oh, no problem at all. Good to hear your voice. Okay. Okay, good question here. Is the webinar being recorded for future use? Yep, I'm recording it now. Not the most flawless execution, but yes, I'm recording it now. I can, I'll figure out how to post it, but yes, I will. All right, I've got a question here from John. When a record is deleted from ICIS, is there any history left in the staging table? Great question. No, there's no way through the batch process to learn about data that's been manipulated by hand at EPA, excuse me, in ICIS-NPDES. So if you're going to do the full batch data flow using the plugin, it might be wise to find a way to go all the way with it, meaning at least for a particular module. Perhaps you want to batch all of your permit and limit and DMR data via full batch, but you're going to handle all of the inspections and enforcement actions by hand. Okay, that's fine. You just don't implement those modules in the full batch. It is modular that way. You only need to implement the modules you want to, and then you can hand enter, hand tailor the data in ICIS-NPDES for those other modules. Great question. Okay. Alyssa asked the question here that I see. ICIS business rules require a facility be entered before the permit basic info. Does the plugin support this business rule? Okay. If the facility data and the basic permit data go in the same submission, in the same batch, ICIS is smart enough to order the transactions in the appropriate order. So you don't need to send your facility data on Monday and your permit data on Tuesday. You can send them both in the same batch, and ICIS will insert the facility before inserting the basic permit. And that's true on down the chain. So if you include the permit, the permitted features, the limit sets, the limits, and a DMR, in theory, it will all get inserted in the appropriate order. Okay. Let's see here. The document says there are 148 staging tables. Why so many? I don't see that many defined in the design document. Can you provide some clarification as to why there are so many? Sure can. I'd be happy to. Anytime there is a list of elements in the XML schema, like a list of telephone numbers or a list of contacts, we need a separate table for that. So there's actually 148 complex types in the XML schema. Okay? So we needed that many tables. And this brings up a good opportunity for me to share with you the implementation guide. In Appendix B of the implementation guide, which I shared on my screen, what we did is we included a block diagram that shows for each module that's supported in ICIS 3.1, what are the tables underneath it. So here's a handful of tables. This looks like about 30 or 40 of them that all relate to permits, limits, and DMRs. And then the other permit components are on the second page, so there's an additional, I don't know, 20-odd tables there. So that's about 40 or so. Another thing to note, too, is we went ahead and created staging tables for every module in ICIS-NPDES, including the ones that aren't supported yet. So there are tables in the staging database for enforcement actions and for violations and for program reports. And if the schema doesn't change between now and December when it's finalized and released as Schema 4.0 by EPA, then those tables are going to be great. You're going to be able to use them, and they'll flow just fine. We'll turn them on. We'll update the scripts so that they're part of the flow, but the tables are already there. So you can start mapping to them today if you want to. The risk is that they'll change, and that you'll need to remap or rechange your ETL if there are tweaks in the schema before it's released. Okay, so trust me, there's only as many tables as we need. We actually normalized it a lot. For example, there's contacts in a number of different areas. Well, we only have one contacts table in the staging database. Okay, we would have wound up with a lot more tables if we would have left everything denormalized like the XML, like a facility set for permits and a facility set for some other data family. Okay, great question, Wayne. Thank you for that one. All right, so I've got one more question from Lawrence. Which data families are going to be used for the pilot in Washington? Well, there are a couple that they are not going to be flowing. I have a list. It's not immediately in front of me. And there's probably a couple that are in 3.1 that they simply don't have. But most of them, of the full 46, they want to flow aspects of 34 of them, so 3/4 of the 46. So most of them is the short answer there. Okay, I don't have any other questions. If you'd like to raise your hand using the raise hand button or pop one into the questions window, that's fine. I can unmute you if you'd like to ask a question. Okay, I've got another question from Wayne. I'm currently sending a single XML file with all of the general permitted features, limit set, limits, etc. Will the node admin require different schedules for all these, or can I still send them as a single payload? Great question. You can send all these in a single payload. It'll do that for you. It actually assembles all the payloads under a single header every time the schedule runs. So yeah, you can send all, I think, 24 of the submission types supported in the 3.1 schema in a single payload. Okay, great question. Hopefully I answered that sufficiently. Let me know if I didn't. All right, another question from Lawrence. Can you go into the auto-generate deletes function? Yes. Auto-generate deletes, how does this work? You can turn it on or off. It works like this. The example I like to use is, let's say in your NPDES system, somebody was typing in data for a permit and they created an outfall and they accidentally marked it as a surface water discharge outfall. And so the ETL process picks that up and sends that over to ICIS, and it gets added to ICIS as an outfall. Okay, well, it turns out it wasn't an external outfall to a surface water. It's actually an internal outfall or to groundwater or something else that shouldn't go to ICIS because it's not covered under the NPDES program. So then that data steward changes the outfall type code. Well, the ETL runs again that night, and now the outfall doesn't get copied over, okay? So, but it's already been sent to ICIS. Well, the change detection process, if you set the auto-generate deletes flag to yes, will say, well, I know I sent this outfall before. It's no longer present. That means I need to delete it. So it'll go ahead and insert into the staging table a delete transaction for that outfall. And it'll go. If you don't want this functionality to occur, you can turn it off. You just set the auto-gen deletes flag to no or clear it out, and it will not generate deletes when the absence of data in the staging tables should not indicate a deletion. So it gives you the flexibility that way. Why would I want to turn off auto deletes? Well, it gets down to that whole incremental submission. If you're only staging DMR data for last month and you have auto delete turned on and it knows it sent data for the previous year, it's going to say, oh, I need to delete everything in ICIS except for the data for last month. And obviously you don't want that to occur if you're doing an incremental data update in your staging environment. So you'd turn off the auto deletes process in that case. It's a little confusing. I think it'll make sense if you dig into it a little more. I hope that made sense. That's the best I could do, though. Any other questions? That's it for the questions list. Okay, I don't see any hands raised. Don't see any more questions. Oh, yes, there's one more. Aaron's asked a question. Hello, is there a submission size limit? It's only governed by your hardware and the hardware at EPA and the processing power therein and how much RAM you have. It's really efficient in the node. We have not done a stress test with monster submissions, but at the end of the day, it's going to be a factor of your server's memory capacity because it builds the XML file in memory and before it writes it to disk. So what can happen if you have just monster submissions? If you tried to resubmit all of your historical DMR data, for example, you could run out of memory. You'll get an out-of-memory exception, and that would show up in the activity log in the node if that was the case.
Yeah, can I add on to that one too?
Sure.
Right now in our production environment, actually, we received a file not all that long ago that had, I believe it was over 45,000 transactions within it, which means a record, 45,000 records in it. It took about, I believe it was 3 minutes maybe to parse it, and then it took just over half an hour to actually run it through the entire, all the batch rules, and then apply the data to the database. So it's, I mean, you can send an awful lot to ICIS and it can still handle it.
Thank you, Allison. If you're concerned about that, if you intend on sending a huge amount of data to ICIS, you'll probably need to find a way to stage it in chunks so it gets sent in chunks. Once the data is set up in the staging environment, the plugin just grabs it all. That's flagged for transmittal, and it'll send it over the wire. So there isn't any manual control over the file size in the node. It's all based on just what's there. Okay, I'm gonna guess. Well, any more questions? Again, can unmute you, or you can use the questions window. Oh, there's one last thing I should mention. There is a Google group that I set up. So far, it's not very popular, but I was thinking that there might be a need for frequent communication as the plugin is updated and as any of the other components of the plugin get updated and released. So I set up a Google group. It's OpenNode2 ICIS-NPDES. There's a link to it on the OpenNode2 Google Code homepage. Also, I think in the email I had sent out to the list I had of people, there was a link. This would be a good place to post questions about how to use the plugin, or you can email me directly. That's fine too. So this is a resource. Nice thing about a group is you can set it up to get a daily digest of emails. So if there is activity in the group, you'll receive a digest once a day with the summary of the emails or posts that have been received to the group. Alternatively, you don't need to subscribe. You could just maybe come and check it out now and then to see if there's any interesting new information to check. So that's a resource that might be worth checking out. Okay, looks like we are all set for this particular presentation. We came in at just under an hour. Allison, do you have any closing words before we end?
The only thing I'd really like to say is I wanted to thank everybody for attending, and I'm hoping you all find this useful. I'm sure you will. Several of you will. Bill is going to provide the slides for this presentation, so I'll distribute that out to you as well. I know somebody asked about the recording, so when he lets me know about where he posts it, I'll let everybody else know about that as well. Feel free to send me emails asking questions. I'm more than happy to go ahead and send them to Bill if you so desire. I don't know, Bill, if you had your contact information out there on the Exchange network as well, but he's easy to find. So if you had questions for him, feel free to ask him directly. That's not a problem either. So I'd like to thank you, and we will talk to you again. Take care, everybody.
Yes, thank everyone. Thank you, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Bye.